The morning mist clung tightly to the cold glass of the window as the silence inside the Havenbrook Mental Rehabilitation Facility remained undisturbed. A pale, bluish light filtered through the high, narrow windows, giving the long hallway a dreamlike haze, as if time itself had slowed down within those concrete walls. Staff in grey uniforms walked with muffled steps, their presence almost ghostly. At the far end of the corridor, in a special containment room designed not for punishment but for isolation, sat Jonah Bellamy, shackled to a chair bolted into the floor. His once vibrant eyes had dimmed to a dull stare, haunted by memories he never managed to escape. Jonah hadn't spoken to anyone in over 6 months, not since the final verdict that declared him criminally insane. But he wasn't mad, or at least not in the way they believed. 5 years had passed since the fire that destroyed the research center in Willow Creek, an inferno that took the lives of 7 people, including Dr. Isaiah Crow, a renowned neuroscientist and mentor to Jonah. Crow had been like a father to him, until the prosecution twisted Jonah's experiments into evidence of delusion and obsession. The media feasted on the narrative. Young prodigy turns unstable, eliminates mentor in a fit of scientific jealousy. The trial was fast, and no one questioned the security footage that appeared incomplete or the witness statements that contradicted themselves. Jonah was locked away, first in a federal psychiatric institution, then transferred to Havenbrook after repeated escape attempts. Now at 34, Jonah sat awaiting what the state called a clinical resolution, a final injection to terminate his treatment after he was deemed too unstable for reintegration and unfit for any further medical progress. They didn't call it an execution, just a necessary closure, but he knew what it meant. He would be gone before nightfall, a life erased not by madness but by silence and neglect. There was only one person who visited him in the last 2 years, Reverend Elsie Langston, a gentle woman in her 60s who spoke to him as if he were still human. She believed in redemption, though she never asked Jonah to confess. She brought books, talked about the world beyond the steel doors, and listened even when he didn't speak. It was to her, months ago, that Jonah whispered a single request: "I want to see Haven." Haven was not a place. It was his dog, a snow-white husky with mismatched eyes, one blue, one green. He had raised Haven since she was a pup, before the fire, before the accusations. They used to hike the trails near his cabin, run through meadows, nap beside the lake. Haven had been his companion, his emotional anchor in a world that often felt too abstract. After his arrest, she was taken in by his only sibling, Naomi, who lived over 100 miles away. Now, with less than 12 hours remaining, Jonah's heart beat only for the chance to see her again, not to speak, not to argue, not to explain, just to feel something real once more. A guard entered quietly, leaving a tray with untouched food from the night before, and paused at the doorway as if hesitating to say something. But nothing came. He turned and left without a word. Across the state, Naomi Bellamy held a trembling coffee mug in her hands. Her apartment was small, cluttered with research papers and half-read novels. On the carpet beside her sat Haven, her tail motionless, eyes locked on her as if sensing her turmoil. Naomi had never believed the charges against her brother. Jonah was intense, yes, sometimes obsessive, but never violent. She had seen what the world never did: his tenderness, his methodical compassion, his inability to hurt anything, even in self-defense. She had received the call an hour ago. The facility director, Dr. Ilara Monroe, explained in clinical terms that Jonah had one final request that was under review. "If approved," she said, "you must arrive with the dog within 3 hours. No delays." Naomi didn't ask if she could bring a lawyer or call a journalist. She just said, "We'll be there." And now, looking into Haven's solemn face, she whispered, "Let's go see Jonah, girl." Haven tilted her head, ears alert, as if understanding every word. Naomi grabbed her coat, the dog's leash and keys, and together they stepped out into the uncertain dawn. The highway leading to Havenbrook stretched endlessly ahead, a strip of cracked asphalt bordered by skeletal trees and rising mist. Naomi drove in silence, one hand clutching the steering wheel, while the other occasionally reached back to rest on Haven's fur. The husky sat calm in the back seat, but her breathing was faster than usual. Naomi glanced at the clock. If the director's words held true, they had just under 2 hours before the opportunity vanished. She couldn't risk arriving even a minute late. There would be no second chances. Back at the facility, Dr. Ilara Munro reviewed the documents for the third time. Her fingers hovered over the line that read, "Exceptionally granted contact visit, subject to discretion of facility director." She was a woman of science bound by rules, but somewhere beneath her precise exterior, doubt stirred. Jonah Bellamy's case had always felt rushed, too tidy. And despite what the report said, he never behaved like a man unhinged, only broken, haunted, betrayed. She had read his research. Brilliant, abstract, potentially revolutionary. If the fire hadn't happened, he might have been nominated for a national award. Now he waited for his final hour, surrounded by wolves that had never once tried to understand him. Jonah stared at the floor, knees pulled close to his chest, as the buzzer from the corridor startled him back into awareness. A different guard this time, Officer Perez, entered and gave a stiff nod. "We're expecting a visitor, get ready." The words echoed like thunder in the sterile silence. Jonah looked up, hope flickering faintly in the back of his eyes. "Haven?" he asked. Perez hesitated before replying, "That's what they told me." Meanwhile, as Naomi's car turned off the main road, approaching the facility's iron gates, she noticed a small group of people gathered near the perimeter, activists, holding signs. Some bore Jonah's face with bold text reading, "Question the system." Others simply said, "Justice isn't always just." Naomi swallowed hard. For years she had fought behind the scenes, emailing experts, filing petitions, sending letters no one answered. And yet here they were, strangers standing in the cold demanding the same thing. Maybe it wasn't too late. Inside Jonah's containment room, Officer Perez helped him change into neutral grey clothing, a standard protocol for end-of-program patients. No personal belongings, no books, no watches. As Jonah slipped his arms into the shirt, he paused and looked directly at the guard. "Will she recognize me?" Perez didn't respond. It wasn't his place to answer questions like that. At the security booth, Naomi rolled down her window, her voice wavering. "I'm here for Jonah Bellamy. I have Haven." The guard checked a clipboard, exchanged a few words over the radio, then opened the outer gate. As the second gate opened slowly, Naomi whispered, "Almost there, girl," her voice trembling under the weight of hope and dread. Haven sat up, alert, tail thumping the seat with cautious anticipation. A nurse passed down the hallway outside Jonah's room and glanced through the observation window. There he was, sitting upright, spine rigid with tension. It wasn't fear, she realized. It was restraint. He was holding himself together by sheer force of will. She had seen patients collapse in their last hours, break down in incoherent desperation, but Jonah remained silent, still, waiting for something no one could predict. Outside the waiting area, Naomi was led in by a female staff member. She held the leash tightly, Haven walking beside her with quiet discipline. The husky's ears twitched as they entered the elevator, the mechanical hum climbing floor by floor. Naomi's heart pounded. What if he had changed too much? What if Haven didn't remember him? What if... Then the elevator doors opened. Down the hallway, through a security checkpoint, a final door with a key code. Inside the room, Jonah sat on a metal bench, hands resting on his knees. His face had aged, thinner, paler, but when the door opened and Haven stepped in, the world cracked open. The husky froze mid-step. Her body trembled. Jonah's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, everything stopped. Then, Haven barked once, a high, sharp sound of recognition. She lunged forward, the leash slipping through Naomi's fingers. Jonah opened his arms and Haven threw herself onto him, her paws wrapping around his chest, tail whipping wildly behind her. His arms tightened around her, his face buried in her fur. Naomi covered her mouth, tears rushing to her eyes. That moment, that embrace, held a power no trial transcript could document. No medication could numb, no mistake could erase. Before we continue, take a moment to breathe in this powerful scene. If you believe in the importance of justice, of love that transcends systems and walls, subscribe to our channel now. Naomi took a step back, giving them space, her chest rising and falling with silent sobs. Jonah didn't speak. He couldn't. Words dissolved somewhere between his throat and the gravity of what was happening. Haven licked his face, whimpered, pressed her weight against him as if afraid that if she let go he'd disappear. 5 years had passed, but to her it was only the absence of scent, the long void of silence. Now he was here, and she remembered him, not as a patient in a facility but as her person. Dr. Monroe stood in the corner, arms crossed, emotion barely hidden behind her measured composure. She cleared her throat softly. "You have 15 minutes." Jonah nodded without looking up. Haven had curled up in his lap, still as stone, her breathing shallow but steady. Naomi stepped closer and sat on the floor beside them. "I wasn't sure we'd make it," she whispered. "Traffic, security, 100 things could have gone wrong." Jonah finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. There were no accusations in his eyes, just weariness, and underneath it, a flicker of gratitude. "You brought her," he said, voice hoarse from disuse. Naomi gave a trembling smile. "Of course I did. You think I'd let them take you without saying goodbye?" She paused. "You were always the strongest of us, you know that? Even when you thought you weren't." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not strong. I just kept waking up, day after day." Naomi's heart clenched at those words. "To wake up not because you want to, but because the alternative never came. Because you're denied even the right to surrender." She reached across Haven's back and took Jonah's hand. It was cold and shaking. "We never stopped trying," she said. "Letters, appeals, petitions. Someone had to listen eventually." Jonah let his eyes close for a second. They didn't. Outside the room, in a discreet office just past the main hallway, Dr. Monroe's assistant tapped frantically at a keyboard. A flagged email had arrived moments ago. It was marked urgent, from an encrypted government channel. The message contained digital files recently decrypted, originating from a cloud account connected to Dr. Isaiah Crow. The assistant's eyes widened as he skimmed the document. Phone records, correspondence, a deleted hard drive log, pieces of a puzzle no one had been allowed to finish. In the adjoining hallway, Officer Perez paced back and forth, checking the clock on the wall. Less than 30 minutes until the scheduled procedure. The facility operated under strict timeline enforcement. The medical team was already preparing the injection room. Silence wasn't unusual here. Havenbrook prided itself on calm transitions, but this morning something in the air felt wrong, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Back in the visitation chamber, Jonah leaned his forehead against Haven's. "I used to dream about this every night. Not the fire, not the trial, just this. Just her." Naomi bit her lip. "They're still saying you were delusional, that your work destabilized you." Jonah turned to her, eyes sharp. "The work wasn't the problem. It was what I found." He exhaled. "Crow and I were testing memory suppression pathways, but he wanted control. He wanted to monetize trauma recovery. He didn't care about ethics." Naomi nodded. She had read parts of Jonah's papers once, fragmented theories on memory restructuring, reattribution protocols, emotional sequencing, far beyond the scope of her own background in psychology. But she understood now. He wasn't the criminal. He had been silenced. Then, a knock on the glass. "Doctor." Monroe entered slowly, holding a tablet in her hands, her eyes focused on Jonah. "Something came through," she said. "Encrypted data linked to your former lab's server. It was intercepted and sent to us by an anonymous source." Naomi stood. "What does it say?" Monroe hesitated. "There are files implicating other researchers in falsifying reports, erasing metadata, even blackmail." Jonah's eyes widened. "You mean—" Monroe interrupted. "There's a strong enough basis to question your sentence, but I can't make the call alone. I've sent it to the board and the state's attorney. We may have a delay, possibly a review." Naomi nearly collapsed from the surge of adrenaline. Jonah stared in disbelief. Haven barked once, sensing the shift in tension. "We're not promising anything," Monroe added, "but if there's even a sliver of doubt, we don't proceed." Jonah reached for Naomi's hand again. "I don't know what to say." Naomi smiled through her tears. "Then don't say anything, just wait, like you always have." As Monroe left the room, she gave him a small nod, not just of authority, but of apology, for the years taken, for the voices ignored, for the man nearly buried under someone else's lies. If this story moved you even slightly, now is the time to subscribe to this channel. Every person watching this video is part of a greater community that believes in second chances. And tell us, have you ever seen someone punished unfairly? What did you do or wish you could have done? Outside the chamber, time ticked forward with a cruel mechanical precision. A wall clock above the main nurse's station marked 8:41 a.m., just 19 minutes before the scheduled injection. In the small administrative office, Dr. Monroe remained on the phone, voice steady but urgent. "We need a formal injunction," she said. "I won't move forward with termination while there's new digital evidence under review. Yes, I understand the statute, But this isn't procedural anymore. It's moral. She hung up before the legal advisor could push back further. In that moment, she made a silent vow. If the system wouldn't pause, she would. Back inside the room, Naomi watched Jonah stroke Haven's fur slowly, as if trying to etch the sensation into his memory. The dog had calmed, curled once again into his lap, eyes blinking slowly in a mix of confusion and comfort. Naomi had seen grief take many forms, but what she saw in Jonah now was something deeper than grief. It was stillness born from long-term internal collapse, the kind that leaves no visible scars, but permanently rewires the soul. "Do you remember," Naomi said softly, "that summer in Laramie, with the fireworks and the storm?" Jonah laughed under his breath. "You mean when I tried to build a homemade lightning sensor and nearly got struck?" Naomi grinned. "Yeah, and Haven hid under the bed for 3 days. That memory, innocent and chaotic, was a bridge to a time before headlines, courts, and injections, a world where they were just a brother and sister, living through wonder and error." Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe received another encrypted message, this one brief but powerful. Data verified. Credible metadata trail established. Records align with whistleblower testimony from 2018 case. Attached was a PDF summary, 10 pages of inconsistencies in the original trial, including timestamps that didn't match up with the building's security logs, and an internal memo from Crow warning staff not to speak about an incident a week before the fire. Jonah's case was no longer just flawed, it was fundamentally broken. In the control room, Officer Perez eyed the incoming alerts, but hesitated to act. He glanced through the one-way glass again. Jonah, Naomi, and the dog sat in a circle of quiet resilience. He keyed the mic. "Dr. Monroe, final confirmation needed. Should we proceed with sedation protocol?" Silence followed. Then Monroe's voice cut in, clear and unwavering. "No. Postpone all procedures. Notify the review board. I'm filing a protective hold." Perez leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of rules give way to something that resembled justice. Inside the chamber, the door creaked open, and Monroe entered again, this time with a different tone in her expression, not clinical, but human. "Jonah," she said gently, "you're not going anywhere today." He blinked. Naomi froze. "What?" Monroe nodded, setting down the tablet. "The evidence is substantial. We've placed an emergency stay on all end-of-treatment measures. You'll remain here, under observation, but no execution. Not until this is thoroughly re-examined." Jonah inhaled sharply, as if only now remembering how to breathe. Haven stood and let out a bark, tail wagging furiously. Naomi covered her mouth, tears falling again, but this time they weren't tears of mourning. They were of disbelief, of release. "You mean," Jonah said slowly, "they're listening." Monroe gave a tight, bittersweet smile. "Finally, yes." Across the hallway, Perez made a note in the system log. "Procedure suspended at 8:49 a.m., pending legal review. Subject transferred to protected status." The news spread through the staff like wildfire. Orderlies whispered in break rooms, nurses paused at their stations, wondering what had changed after so long. For years, Jonah Bellamy had been just another shadow in the system. Now he was a name again, a man again, a case that could unravel everything they thought was neatly archived. In the visitors' room, Naomi stood and hugged Jonah, still kneeling beside Haven. "You did it," she said. "No," he corrected. "We did. Before we move forward, if this moment filled you with even the smallest bit of hope, don't just feel it, share it. Comment below, what does justice mean to you? And don't forget to subscribe. We're building a space for stories that matter, and you're part of that mission." Down the long corridor that once echoed with inevitability, the mood had shifted, like the sudden breaking of a storm. Guards exchanged quiet looks, and even the cold fluorescents above seemed to hum differently. Dr. Monroe returned to her office, where a blinking cursor waited atop a blank document, a preliminary report that could lead to a formal re-examination of Jonah's conviction. She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing the first sentence. Patient Jonah Bellamy's scheduled termination was suspended due to emergent digital evidence and corroborating anomalies discovered in the original trial. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one the system had not planned for, but one that could no longer be ignored. Back in the chamber, Jonah sat on the floor, Haven lying beside him, her head resting on his knee. He stroked her back in slow, deliberate motions. "She still smells the same," he whispered. Naomi smiled. "She never forgot you, not for a second." They sat in silence, the kind only family can share, when no words are needed, only presence. The sounds of distant keys jangling and intercom buzzes faded into irrelevance. For the first time in years, Jonah didn't feel like a case number. He felt like someone whose life still held value. Outside the facility, clouds began to part, allowing light to pour through in thin, golden shafts. The protesters at the fence weren't cheering because they didn't yet know, but something in the air shifted. A few glanced up from their signs. A breeze moved. Some turned to each other, hope igniting in cautious glances. At the state legal department in the capital, Assistant Attorney Mason Alvarez reviewed the forwarded documents with a furrowed brow. His team was small and overworked, but he had a reputation for integrity. The evidence in Jonah's case disturbed him. Too many red flags, too many assumptions dressed as facts. He picked up the phone and called his superior. "We need to delay everything. There's a miscarriage here, and I won't rubber stamp an execution under these circumstances." While legal gears began to turn, slow but deliberate, Jonah leaned his head against the cool wall and spoke without opening his eyes. "You know what hurts the most?" Naomi stayed quiet, listening. "It's not the isolation, or the silence, or even the waiting. It's the fact that I started to believe them, that maybe I was the monster they painted." He paused. "But then she walked in, and everything made sense again." Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were never the monster. You were a threat to people who had something to hide. That's why they buried you." She looked down at Haven, who wagged her tail in response to her name. But they couldn't bury this bond. In another corner of the building, Officer Perez received a quiet notification on his internal monitor. "State Attorney's Office has acknowledged receipt of files, full review underway, expected response within 48 hours. He read it twice before whispering to himself, it might actually happen. Meanwhile, Monroe drafted a formal letter to the State Board requesting an internal audit of the facility's role in Jonah's case. It was a bold move, and possibly a dangerous one for her career, but she no longer cared. Whatever this cost her professionally would never outweigh the cost of silence. As she wrote, her thoughts wandered to her first day at Havenbrook, how she had hoped to make a difference. This, she realized, was her chance. In a holding room not far from the chamber, a journalist from a regional paper named Ezra Quinn waited patiently. He had shown up that morning expecting a simple story, a man's last day, but now found himself in the middle of something far more complex. A nurse, unsure of protocol, allowed him to remain after seeing his press credentials. Ezra reviewed his notes, rereading Jonah's case file, the inconsistencies, the gaps in logic. "This is bigger than a footnote," he muttered, opening his laptop. "This is the headline." Back in the chamber, Naomi stood. "I'll go make a call," she said. "Mum's been lighting candles for days. She'll want to hear your voice when they let you call out." Jonah nodded. "Tell her I remember the garden, the sunflowers. That's what I held on to." Naomi blinked back more tears. "She'll be so proud." As she walked out, Haven remained, curled beside Jonah like a living memory. He whispered softly, "You kept me sane, didn't you, girl? When everything else faded, it was your face I kept seeing." If this story is giving you chills, real ones, it's because truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deep it's buried. If you've ever held on to hope when no one else did, share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need it right now. And make sure to subscribe. Our next chapter will take you even deeper into the lives that the world tried to forget. As Naomi stepped out into the corridor, the sterile hum of the facility felt almost unreal compared to what she had just left behind. She paused near the nurse's station, trying to find her breath. For the first time in years, she wasn't preparing herself for loss. She was holding onto something fragile and alive, the possibility of justice. Pulling her phone from her coat pocket, she called her mother. The phone rang only once before being answered. "Naomi," came the voice on the other end, thick with worry. "He's still alive," Naomi said immediately, barely holding back the emotion. "And there's new evidence. The execution's been stopped, at least for now." On the other end, silence, followed by a sob, then a prayer whispered in Spanish. "Gracias a Dios," her mother breathed. "Gracias." Meanwhile, inside Jonah's chamber, Haven had nestled against his chest, her breathing syncing with his. He stared at the ceiling, recalling the scent of his father's cologne, the sound of the piano his mother once played, and the feeling of waking up in a room not made of steel. Everything that had been stripped away by time, fear, and bureaucracy now floated back, tethered by a dog's warmth and a sister's defiance. For years, Jonah had taught himself to numb the ache, but now pain returned, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that reminds you you're still human. Downstairs in a secured archive room, two legal interns sent by the state attorney's office combed through boxes of physical evidence from the original case. Among sealed envelopes and folders labeled Exhibit, they discovered something curious, a surveillance backup hard drive marked with a date 1 week prior to the incident. It hadn't been logged in any court record. One intern carefully inserted it into a terminal, and after a few minutes of decrypted playback, they stared at footage that contradicted a foundational claim from Jonah's trial. Dr. Crow wasn't alone in the lab the night before the fire. Someone else was there, someone whose face was blurred but whose access ID flashed briefly on screen before being removed. They quickly clipped the footage and forwarded it with the subject line, "Urgent, chain of custody breach." On the other side of Havenbrook, Dr. Munro's inbox pinged with the new file. She watched the footage in silence. Her hands trembled. She had suspected for weeks that something about Crow's narrative didn't make sense, but this was undeniable. A second person in the lab, unreported, later erased from the logs. She didn't recognize the face, but the ID tag would be enough to request identity verification. She forwarded the file to the district office, added an internal incident report, then stood up and left her office. Time was no longer the enemy. It was now her weapon. In the visitation room, a gentle knock on the door brought Jonah out of his reverie. It was Perez. "You have another guest," he said. Jonah sat up, puzzled. "Who?" The door opened, and to his astonishment, a man in a dark green overcoat stepped in. "Ezra Quinn," the man said, holding out a hand. "Journalist. I've been following your case since 2019. They finally let me in." Jonah looked to Perez, who nodded. "Dr. Munro approved it. Says the world deserves to hear your voice." Jonah stood slowly, reaching out to shake Ezra's hand. His fingers still trembled, but there was strength there. Earned strength. "I didn't think anyone was listening," Jonah said. Ezra smiled slightly. "We're always listening. Sometimes we just need someone brave enough to speak first." Ezra pulled out a recorder. "I'd like to ask you a few questions, on record. Your side of the story." Jonah glanced down at Haven, then to the door Naomi had exited through, and finally back to Ezra. "You ready?" the journalist asked. Jonah exhaled. "Yeah. Let's start with the night of the fire." As Ezra clicked record, something shifted again. Not just in that room, but in the story of a man who had been silenced for years. This wasn't just a final interview. It was the beginning of something larger, the restoration of a truth buried under concrete, negligence and pride. Sometimes justice begins not with a courtroom, but with a conversation. If you believe stories like Jonah's need to be told, write "I'm listening" in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This journey is far from over, and you won't want to miss what comes next. As Jonah began to speak, his voice was steady, though quieter than expected, like a man remembering how to command his own narrative after years of being reduced to someone else's villain. "The night of the fire," he said. "I was supposed to leave early. Crow had been distant all week, secretive. I knew something was wrong with the data we'd collected, but every time I brought it up, he shut me out." Ezra nodded silently, letting him lead. "That night," Jonah continued, "I stayed behind to check the server integrity. Crow left around 9, or at least that's what I thought." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then, just after midnight, I heard the alarm. I was on the north wing, not even close to the combustion lab. By the time I got there, the entire side was engulfed. I ran for help. But by the time security arrived, the narrative had already begun." Ezra leaned forward. "So who started it?" Jonah's jaw clenched. "I don't know. But someone wanted that lab erased, and now we know Crow wasn't alone." Ezra lowered the recorder for a moment. "You ever wonder why now? Why all this is coming up at the very edge of time?" Jonah didn't hesitate. "Because truth resists burial, and guilt has a way of cracking even the most polished lies." From the corner of the room, Haven stood and stretched, yawning softly before padding over to lay at Jonah's feet. Ezra caught the moment on his phone. "You mind?" he asked. Jonah shook his head. "Let people see her. She's the only part of me that never gave up." Elsewhere in the facility, Dr. Munro met quietly with a state-appointed investigator who had arrived under the radar. His badge said Oversight Division, but his demeanor was more informal, almost apologetic. "This case smells rotten," he told her. "We've pulled 3 more inconsistencies from the fire inspection report. A lab assistant whose statement disappeared. a backup camera that was supposedly offline, but now shows signs of editing. Monroe crossed her arms. "How long until you make it official?" He frowned. "If I had full authority. Today. But we have to follow protocol. Meanwhile, we buy time, and we keep him breathing." Perez passed by the observation room again and noticed Ezra interviewing Jonah. It felt strange, almost wrong, to see Jonah speaking freely after so many years of watching him from the other side of glass. And yet, it also felt like justice, slow and imperfect, was finally learning how to walk again. In the facility's legal records room, one of the interns reviewing old files gasped. "You need to see this," she told her colleague, pointing to a signed affidavit from a former lab partner of Crow's. Dated a year before the fire, it mentioned conflicts over intellectual property and warned of escalating secrecy among senior staff. The statement had never been filed in the trial evidence. "Someone buried this," the intern whispered. Meanwhile, in the waiting lounge, Naomi sat with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of vending machine coffee. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Monroe. "He's still safe. Legal team reviewing evidence. I believe we're close." Naomi read it 3 times. She looked up toward the hallway where she had left Jonah and Haven, and for a moment she let herself believe, not in miracles, but in the power of persistence. Back in the room, Ezra wrapped up the interview. "Last question," he said. "If they overturn the ruling, what's the first thing you'll do?" Jonah didn't even have to think. "Take Haven. Go somewhere green. Breathe air that isn't filtered through vents. Sit in the sun and say nothing for hours." Ezra smiled. "That's a headline waiting to happen." He stood, shook Jonah's hand again, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused. "You know," he said, "some stories change the world not because they're loud, but because they whisper the one thing people are most afraid to hear." "We got it wrong," Jonah nodded. "Then let them hear it. If this chapter gave you chills, share this story. Let it echo. What would you do if the world gave you back the time it tried to steal? Hit subscribe, we're not done. The next moment may be the one that finally turns the tide." Ezra stepped out of the chamber and into the corridor with his recorder still running in one hand, but his mind was already shaping the story. Not just a profile of Jonah Bellamy, the wrongly condemned researcher, but a cautionary tale about how a system designed to uphold truth had once again almost crushed it. He passed through the double doors and out into the grey morning light. Protesters outside the gates looked up as he appeared, unsure of who he was. One held a cardboard sign that read, "Justice for the Silenced." Ezra raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement. Soon they would know everything. Back in the chamber, Jonah remained seated with Haven, their silence now serene rather than resigned. The tension that had bound his shoulders for so long seemed to melt, even if just for a while. Naomi returned, her eyes puffy from crying, but her posture stronger than ever. "The press is outside," she said gently. "Your name is out there. People are finally hearing it." Jonah didn't answer. He simply reached for her hand and squeezed. "I don't need the world to hear it," he murmured. "I just need them to listen." As the review board in the Capitol prepared for an emergency meeting, Monroe submitted an urgent request for protective status, not only for Jonah, but also for the new evidence, to be safeguarded from tampering. She knew how easily files disappeared, how often glitches destroyed truth. She printed 3 copies of the documents and stored them in separate physical locations within the facility. She wasn't just protecting a patient, she was guarding a narrative that had been buried for half a decade. Elsewhere in the facility, the security team pulled up personnel files linked to the ID badge seen in the recovered footage. It belonged to a technician who had left Havenbrook's sister lab 2 weeks after the fire. No reason given, no follow-up interview. His record had been clean, but gaps in his digital footprint raised red flags. Monroe contacted the oversight agent immediately. "We need to find this man," she said. "He holds the missing link." As more details emerged, Naomi sat with Jonah and began reading the comments appearing on Ezra's social media posts. People from all over the country were reacting, some in disbelief, some in rage, others in sorrow. But one comment stood out, posted by a user named UxNeuroscholar85. "I worked under Crow. We all knew Jonah didn't set that fire. They made an example out of him." Naomi stared at the comment, her fingers trembling as she replied, "Please DM, we need you." Down the hall, the execution room that had been meticulously prepared now stood empty. The medical team, previously briefed for the injection, had been reassigned pending investigation. The gurney, stark under the surgical light, was covered again. One of the technicians folded the final sheet and paused. Feels good, she whispered to herself. Feels right. The state attorney's office issued a public statement confirming a hold on all termination-related procedures at Havenbrook, citing the discovery of newly authenticated digital evidence of significant weight. News outlets began circulating the story. Execution halted hours before deadline. New evidence could overturn 5-year sentence. Researcher or scapegoat? The Jonah Bellamy case. What began as a whisper had become a storm. Naomi turned to Jonah with a cautious smile. "You're trending." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "That's a sentence I never thought I'd hear again." But it wasn't ego. It was disbelief. That people finally cared. That somewhere beyond those walls, the world wasn't just moving on. It was looking back. Outside, as rain began to fall softly on the facility's roof, Haven rested her head on Jonah's lap again. He leaned down, kissed her between the ears, and closed his eyes. "I thought this would be the end," he whispered. "But maybe it's the beginning. You've made it this far, thank you. This story isn't fiction for many people around the world. Wrongful convictions, systemic failures, and buried truths happen every day. Leave a comment. What would you do if the system failed someone you love? And if you want to see how this all unfolds, subscribe now. Your support keeps stories like this alive." By midday, the atmosphere around Havenbrook had shifted from quiet anticipation to full-scale alert. News vans lined the entrance road. Journalists with umbrellas crowded behind barricades, speaking into microphones with urgency and awe. Drone cameras hovered overhead, capturing every angle of the institution that, just hours ago, had prepared to carry out a state-sanctioned execution. Now that same facility stood at the center of a national conversation about justice, evidence, and how close a man had come to being erased. Inside, however, Jonah Bellamy remained unaware of the scale of what was unfolding beyond those walls. He only knew that, for the first time in years, he wasn't waiting to die. He was waiting to live. In a different wing of the building, Monroe and the oversight investigator paced beside a whiteboard filled with names, timestamps, and highlighted statements. The technician seen in the footage had been located, now working under a new name at a private data lab in another state. Monroe had issued a formal request for a deposition, citing prosecutorial misconduct and concealed evidence. The oversight agent was already drafting a brief to freeze all legal actions against Jonah until this secondary witness could testify. Everything was now a race against the system's inertia. Naomi sat beside Jonah again, scrolling through message after message. Some were from old colleagues of his, scientists who had once worked with or under him, reaching out in private to express regret. Others were from strangers, former inmates, public defenders, trauma survivors, who simply wrote things like, "I believe you," and "You matter." Naomi handed Jonah the phone. "People are starting to see you again." He read the messages in silence, his thumb hovering over the screen. "They're not just seeing me," he said softly. "They're seeing themselves." That's what this really is. People need to believe that broken things can be fixed. The journalist Ezra had already filed the first part of his piece, a long-form digital article titled "The Man They Almost Buried." Within the hour, it had been shared over 30,000 times, triggering debates on news panels and prompting calls for a statewide audit on all closed capital cases within the past decade. His second installment, now in progress, would include clips from his interview, analysis of the suppressed files, and an open call for any former staff or whistleblowers to come forward. Ezra wasn't just writing a story, he was documenting a turning point. Haven, who had once been denied entry to the facility under security protocol, now roamed freely in the visitation room. Guards walked by and smiled. Nurses left bowls of water near her spot. She had become more than Jonah's dog. She was a symbol of loyalty, of memory, of the bond that couldn't be erased even by chains. Jonah watched her now, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing her back. "She's older," he murmured, "but she still moves like we're back in the woods, like the world's still full of space." Monroe entered a moment later, with a sealed envelope in her hand. She offered a small nod to Naomi before turning to Jonah. "You'll want to read this," she said, handing it to him. He opened the envelope slowly, fingers shaking slightly, and pulled out a single-page statement. At the top, in bold letters, "Temporary reversal of termination order. Jonah Bellamy to remain under protected review status until formal evidentiary hearing is held." He stared at the paper, then at Monroe. "Does this mean—" She nodded. "It means you're not dying today, or tomorrow. It means we're going to fight this properly now." Jonah looked down, emotion swelling in his chest like a flood held back too long. Naomi placed a hand over his. "We're not done, but we're not broken anymore either." Elsewhere, a copy of the footage showing the second figure in the lab had already been analyzed by 2 independent forensic experts. Both confirmed the ID tag sequence belonged to a known data security contractor who had left the field shortly after the incident. Monroe submitted their findings along with a request to the State Appellate Board to vacate the original conviction entirely. Meanwhile, Havenbrook's own staff gathered quietly in the break room. People who had never spoken openly about Jonah's case were now discussing it in soft voices filled with guilt and disbelief. "I always thought it didn't add up," one nurse whispered, "but we just followed the file." Another added, "I used to think silence was neutrality, but silence nearly killed that man. Every system has cracks. What matters is whether we dare to look inside them." Leave a comment. Have you ever stayed silent when your voice could have made a difference? What did it cost you? And remember, subscribing helps push stories like this into the world, so others don't have to suffer in the dark. As afternoon turned to early evening, golden light filtered through the narrow windows of Havenbrook, casting soft shadows across the facility's usually sterile halls. But today, the atmosphere felt different, alive, expectant, almost reverent. News of the halted execution had reached national outlets. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Free Jonah Bellamy and Truth Before Judgment. Advocacy groups began organizing live streams and candlelight vigils outside the facility gates. Inside, Jonah sat quietly, still in the visitation room, now surrounded by warmth instead of clinical indifference. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but he wasn't running from it either. Naomi had just stepped out to take a call from a civil rights attorney offering pro bono assistance. Jonah remained seated with Haven, who rested her chin on his knee. He ran his hand slowly through her fur. "I used to count how many steps it took to get from the bed to the wall in my cell," he whispered. 34 steps. That was my whole world for 5 years. He looked down at Haven. "Now I don't want to measure anything. I just want to be still." In the oversight office, the investigator received a secure call from the district appellate judge. "Preliminary review of the new evidence warrants a full rehearing," the judge confirmed. "I'll issue the order tonight. The conviction is not being overturned, yet, but the state will be required to justify every piece of the original case. That means testimony, evidence, chain of custody, and prosecution conduct will all be re-examined." The investigator closed the call, turned to Dr. Monroe, and said, "We just opened the door. Let's see who dares walk through." Across the state, a wave of emails, anonymous tips, and archived documents poured into the inboxes of Ezra Quinn and legal aid organizations tracking wrongful convictions. Former employees of the Crow Institute, ex-colleagues of Jonah, and even former students began to share fragments of memory, suspicion, or data that painted a different picture of what really happened before the fire. Ezra stared at his screen, stunned by the volume. "It's not just one man's redemption," he said aloud. "It's a pattern." Meanwhile, Naomi returned to Jonah, holding a folded sheet of paper. "The state judge is calling for a full review," she said, unable to contain the relief in her voice. "They want everything back on the table." Jonah blinked, letting the words sink in. "So, they're finally willing to listen?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, and this time they'll have to listen to all of it." Jonah leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. He didn't cry, but the quiet tremor in his shoulders spoke louder than sobs. Naomi sat beside him. Haven climbed into his lap again, unfazed by titles or legal milestones. Just her human, still here, still fighting. Down the hall, Monroe gathered her most trusted staff. "From this point forward, all documentation about Jonah Bellamy is to be copied and stored redundantly," she ordered. "Every file, video, and internal memo. If it has his name on it, I want it backed up 3 times. One nurse asked, "Are we preparing for someone to interfere?" Monroe looked her in the eye. "I'm preparing for the truth to survive, just in case someone tries to silence it again." In another wing, a call came through from the governor's office. The communication was terse but clear. "Monitor the Bellamy case closely. Public interest is intensifying. Political optics must be managed." Monroe heard the subtext. Damage control had begun, but she didn't care. This wasn't about careers anymore. It was about consequences. That night, Jonah was offered a temporary room separate from the medical unit. Small, quiet, but with a window that actually opened. Naomi helped move his few belongings, mostly books and drawings from years past. As she handed him a tattered sketch of Haven, Jonah laughed. "I remember doing this the day we brought her home. I wanted to capture her ears just right." Naomi grinned. "You didn't, by the way." He shrugged. "I had time to practice." This story is a reminder. Time doesn't always heal, but truth has a way of catching up to silence. Comment below, what does hope mean to you when the world tries to shut it down? And don't forget to subscribe. We still have 2 chapters left, and they'll change everything. That evening, while the rest of the facility settled into its usual rhythm of locked doors and dimmed lights, Jonah sat on the edge of the new cot in his reassigned room. The walls were still plain, the air still cool, but something was different. This room didn't feel like a cell. It felt like a pause, a suspended moment in time before something bigger. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor nearby. Haven sprawled out between them. For the first time in 5 years, there was no ticking clock counting down his life. There was only the quiet thrum of possibility. Outside the room, Monroe stood near the security monitors, speaking quietly with Perez. "If anyone comes requesting his transfer," she said, "I want to be notified immediately. No movement, no decisions without my signature." Perez nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You're doing the right thing, Doc." She didn't reply. She just looked at the screen showing Jonah laughing softly as Haven nudged him with her paw. "Let's make sure no one erases this again." Far away, in a modest house surrounded by dark pines, a man watched the coverage of Jonah Bellamy's case on a flickering TV. His hands trembled. He knew that face. He had known the truth for years, kept silent out of fear, buried it under the weight of paycheck and survival. But now his name had been mentioned, buried in those metadata reports. If the system called him to testify, he'd have to choose safety or conscience. He reached for his phone, stared at it, and dialed a number he had deleted but never forgotten. "I have something to say," he whispered when the line clicked. "And I should have said it a long time ago." Back at Havenbrook, Monroe received a notification. The anonymous source who had provided the original footage had just sent a second batch. This time, internal emails between Crow and unnamed investors discussing profit margins related to the trial data Jonah had originally flagged as compromised. Attached was a spreadsheet detailing financial forecasts based on a pending patent Crow had quietly filed in his own name, one that borrowed heavily from Jonah's unpublished research. Monroe forwarded everything to the appellate judge with a single line: intentional suppression of authorship, likely motive, strong grounds for reversal. Meanwhile, Naomi sat with Jonah, scrolling through a new batch of messages. "There's a petition circulating for a public hearing," she said. "It's gaining thousands of signatures an hour." Jonah looked up. "Are they doing it for me or for them?" Naomi hesitated. "Both," she said honestly, "because your story feels like their own. Lost. Ignored. Misunderstood." Jonah nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the point." In the temporary holding room across the facility, Ezra reviewed the footage he had gathered, the audio from Jonah's interview playing softly in the background. He edited a clip of Jonah holding Haven and captioned it simply, "The dog never forgot. Why did we?" Within minutes of posting, it had gone viral. Celebrities, activists, and everyday citizens shared it across platforms with captions like, "This could have been anyone," and "Justice delayed is still worth fighting for." Naomi left Jonah's room briefly to call their mother again. This time, her voice wasn't shaky. "He's resting," she said, "and he's safe, at least for now." On the other end, their mother whispered, "I lit another candle. This time, I asked for truth, not just peace." Jonah turned off the overhead light and sat by the small window. For the first time, he could open it. The night air brushed against his face like a forgotten comfort. Haven curled at his feet, her breathing slow and steady. He looked up at the stars, distant and unchanged. "You stayed," he whispered to her. "Everyone left, but you stayed." The dog lifted her head and looked at him with that same patient gaze she had since she was a pup. She didn't need to understand words. She felt the shift. And for the first time in 5 years, so did Jonah. If this story has stayed with you, share it. Stories like Jonah's exist in silence until we dare to give them voice. What part of this journey spoke to your experience? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe now. The final chapter is coming, and with it the truth that changes everything. Morning came with a pale warmth that touched the metal rooftops of Havenbrook, softening the usual cold geometry of the facility. For the first time in years, Jonah woke up not to the sound of keys or orders, but to the quiet rustle of a breeze coming through a cracked window. and the steady breathing of Haven curled beside him. He sat up slowly, his body still adjusting to the absence of dread. No countdown today, no final meal, just a sliver of normal that felt almost too fragile to be real. Elsewhere in the building, Dr. Monroe poured herself a cup of stale coffee and reviewed the latest message from the appellate board. Full evidentiary hearing approved. Timeline expedited. Jonah Bellamy's case officially reopened under emergency review clause. She stared at the screen, her chest tightening with something that almost felt like relief. Not a celebration, not yet, but it was movement. Real, official movement. She pressed print and walked it straight to Jonah's temporary room herself. Jonah opened the door with a calm he hadn't known in years. Haven followed at his heels. Monroe handed him the paper and simply said, "It's happening." He scanned it, heart racing slowly for once, and then looked up. "So what now?" She smiled. "Now we fight. This time with everything in the open." Meanwhile, Naomi stood outside in the courtyard, her phone buzzing with constant notifications. She had become an accidental spokesperson, pulled into interviews, live streams, podcasts. "I'm not an activist," she'd said once. "I'm just someone who didn't stop asking questions." But to the thousands watching online, she had become a symbol of what love looks like when it refuses to vanish. In another city, the technician identified in the surveillance footage walked into a district courtroom, escorted by 2 federal agents. His lawyer carried a sealed affidavit. Inside were timestamps, server records, and a sworn statement admitting he had been ordered to wipe data by a third party. It named names. It exposed motives. It implicated individuals who once sat on prestigious panels and signed funding deals in back rooms. Ezra, watching from a courthouse bench, quietly hit publish on the next chapter of his article. The title read, "The Collapse of Silence." The first line, "What we call justice is often just timing." And Jonah Bellamy's time has finally come. Back in Havenbrook, Jonah stepped outside under full supervision, not as a free man yet, but as a man no longer forgotten. He felt the sunlight on his face. Haven sniffed the air, then looked up at him and wagged her tail. "You were right," he said to her. "We weren't done." Naomi joined him, and the three stood in silence. No words needed. 3 weeks later, Jonah walked into a courtroom wearing a suit donated by a local non-profit. Naomi sat behind him. Ezra sat 2 rows back, recorder in hand. The technician testified. Monroe provided files. The prosecutor struggled to defend omissions that had once seemed irrelevant, but now felt damning. And when it was all over, the judge read the ruling. The court finds sufficient evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and suppressed exculpatory material. The conviction is vacated. Jonah Bellamy is hereby released from custody, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in a wave of emotion so powerful it left even the bailiff speechless. Jonah sat frozen. Naomi covered her mouth. Haven, sitting quietly at her feet, let out a soft whimper, as if sensing that something sacred had finally been returned. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Flashbulbs exploded. Jonah stood beside Naomi, Haven at his side, and for the first time spoke freely. "They took 5 years from me, but they didn't take me. And now I get to choose what comes next." In the months that followed, Jonah stayed quiet. He didn't sign book deals. He didn't go on talk shows. Instead, he moved into a small cabin near the woods he once hiked with Haven. Naomi visited often. So did Monroe, who had left Havenbrook to join a national reform task force. Ezra won a journalism award, but in his speech, he only thanked Jonah, Naomi, and a dog who never forgot. And as for Haven, she lived out her days as she began them, by Jonah's side, running through fields, napping by the porch, chasing leaves, never far from the man she waited for. This isn't just the end of Jonah's story. It's the beginning of every story like his, waiting to be heard. Share your thoughts, share your voice. Tell us, who would you wait 5 years for? And if this journey touched you, subscribe now, because silence only wins when we stop telling the truth. Justice delayed is not justice denied. When we refuse to let go,